Hello friends, welcome back to my channel and welcome to another sewing video slash vlog slash tutorial. And honestly, this one is super sweet and special because I am sitting down to work on a baby quilt for my sister who is having a baby, and her baby shower is coming up in Texas, and so I wanted to make a super fun and sweet quilt for her, in addition to another super fun DIY sewing project that I thought would be such a fun addition to her baby nursery. So about like a year and a half ago, I decided that I wanted to get into the habit of making small baby quilts for the people that I knew in my life, friends and family that were having babies, and be able to bless them with a quilt that was handmade that they could use for their baby, and that would be more of just kind of like a really treasured little piece. I feel like we have gotten so used to just buying gifts in our world, and obviously there's nothing wrong with that. There are many things that are very practical, especially for someone who's having a baby, that you need to go out and buy. But I think those thoughtful handmade gifts are gifts that are really tender and sweet and that people really appreciate. And I love to use my love of sewing to be able to bless other people. So making a baby quilt for someone is just a really special way that I get to celebrate that new life. So a year and a half ago, I made a baby quilt for someone, and after doing that, I thought I should just get into the habit of making these baby quilts every time I get, you know, a baby shower invite. So I'm currently working on a baby quilt for someone else who recently had a baby, but then obviously my sister is having a baby and her baby shower is coming up, and so I obviously wanted to make her a quilt. And I also want to make this quilt in like a print and a theme that's going to fit kind of the colors and style that she's planning on for her baby nursery. Outside of the quilt, I also want to make her these really cute stuffed fabric letters that spell out her baby's name. So this is a picture of kind of like my idea and inspiration. I feel like I've seen so many people recently making these really fun stuffed fabric letters, and they are such an easy sewing project, perfect for those of you who are beginners. If you have kids, it's such a fun little way of making a sign for a birthday, or making a sign for their room or nursery, or making a sign for someone who is going to have a baby, and creating this custom decoration that spells out their baby's name. So I thought it would be such a fun addition that we could use at her baby shower, but then she can also use it in the baby nursery. And then the colors for the letters are going to match the quilt that I'm making for her. So lots of fun things going on there. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through kind of my method of how I so far have been making baby quilts, because they are just a very standard, easy, tons of 5-inch squares that you sew together, all the different patterns. You add a border, you add quilt batting, you add a backing, and you call it a day. I definitely could get much more complicated in creating very unique and intricate quilt squares, which I would love to do one day, but sometimes I just love the simplicity for a baby quilt, and so that's what I'm going with for this. So when we get to the quilting stage, I will show you kind of my formula and like my diagram with all of the math, so that you know exactly how much fabric to cut for all of your quilt squares and for your border as well as your backing. Now, this quilt kind of design and size was actually inspired by a project that I did in my college sewing class. For my very first sewing class, we had a project called the Scrappy Quilt Project, and essentially we cut 5-inch fabric squares out of all the scrap fabric in our sewing lab, and we created, each of us, like our own version of a scrappy quilt by just sewing together all these 5-inch squares, adding a backing, and quilting it together. And then we donated those to the local Head Start program, and I always just really loved that project. And so when I started teaching high school fashion design, my first year of teaching, I had all of my students do that same quilt project, and all of them used the scrap fabric in our classroom, and each of them made their own version of a scrappy quilt that we then donated to a local pregnancy center. So all of the measurements and the formula for this quilt come from both of those projects, and so I'm excited to share this with you because it really is truly such a perfect beginner project, because all you need to know how to do is sew straight lines and connect and sew different straight edge squares together. So if you've never quilted before, this is very user-friendly, hopefully low pressure, and hopefully enjoyable and fun. And if you've been wanting to make a unique handmade gift for someone, this is the perfect project for you to try. Now again, outside of the quills, I'm going to be making the puffy letters, and those are going to be made out of fabric that corresponds with the quilt. So let me show you what fabric I ended up picking out and how I'm going to use it. So this is my order of fabric. I decided to just order fabric from a quilt shop, mainly because what I love about quilt stores is there's always what I guess you would call like fabric collections or lines, where some kind of fabric designer has created all these different prints that correspond and go together. So all the colors are in the same palette, so you have all of these different floral prints and maybe abstract prints, but all of the colors are kind of a part of the same collection. I just love that for quilting. So I ordered all of my fabric from Missouri Star Quilt Company. I actually ordered fabric from them like a year and a half ago to make a baby quilt for my husband's cousin, and I was looking for a specific kind of farm style fabric since she was having a little boy and they live on a farm, and I found the cutest fabric. If I can find a picture of that quilt, I'll try to pop it up on the screen because it turned out absolutely so adorable. So I wanted to do the same thing for my sister. Now usually what I do for these quilts, and it's a great like quilting hack to keep you from having to cut like tons of squares for a fabric, is I buy the pre-cut 5-inch quilt squares. I think they're called just like 5-inch packs, but if you go to any kind of quilting store or website, you will see these packs of like pre-cut 5-inch squares, and I think they also offer 10-inch squares, but I always buy the 5-inch because that's what I use for my quilts, and they're all in the corresponding fabrics, and so all I have to do is buy additional fabric for the border and the backing. Anyways, I was planning on doing that for this project, but because I want to make the puffy name like garland letters to match the quilt, I knew that I was going to need more fabric, so I decided to just order an entire pack of fat quarters. And so this is my pack of fat quarters. So these are going to give me enough fabric to select what prints I want to spell out her name, but then also to cut all of my 5-inch squares. So there's going to be a little bit more cutting in my project rather than just laying out all of my squares and sewing them together, but that's okay. And I wanted to make sure that I had plenty of fabric. Now, if you aren't familiar with fat quarters are a cut of fabric that is offered at fabric stores, and essentially it's a cut of fabric that's 18 by 22 inches. So it is honestly a lot of fabric to work with, especially since in quilting you're cutting a lot of little pieces and then sewing them together to create your actual square that can be anywhere from like 5 to 11 inches in size. So the fat quarters are going to give me plenty of fabric to use for the letters, and then all of the extra I'm going to be using for the actual squares for the quilt. So anyways, this is what the pack looks like of my fat quarters. I can't remember how much I paid for these. I feel like it was around maybe $20 or $30, which is a little bit on the steep side for fabric if you know me, because I'm so used to thrifting fabric, but it is well worth spending that money to create a precious quilt for my sister. So this like print and color collection is called Secret Garden. There's 13 fat quarters, so I have 13 different prints to choose from, and I chose them because this Secret Garden collection is just the most beautiful florals, and my sister is going for like a really fun like peachy pink and blue and green kind of floral, naturally kind of baby room. That's her color, so I thought that all of these prints would just be so perfect. And then there you have some gingham. I think there's like a fruit print. This blue is so pretty, so I add, oh, there's the fruit print, like little oranges, so cute. So I will show you what all of these fabric prints look like close up. So these are all my fat quarters that I'm going to be using for the letters and the quilt. And then for this quilt, I always put a border that's about a 5-inch border all the way around, and usually that's either a solid color or a fabric that corresponds to the prints already in the quilt. So if I'm using any kind of fabric collection that has multiple prints to choose from and I'm getting it from a quilt shop, you always have the option of buying pre-cut squares, fat quarters, strips for quilting, or buying fabric by the yard. And so I also picked up half a yard of the green and white gingham. So I'm going to use this for the border, mainly because the majority of the quilt is going to be floral, but there is going to be one square that is the green and white gingham, and so I thought having the border as a gingham would just really contrast well with the floral. And then usually for the backing of my quilts, I love to use a flannel, but I decided to just order fabric that corresponded to the rest of the prints in the quilt, so I didn't have to go to the store. And so I chose this beautiful peachy pink cotton fabric that is from the Secret Garden collection, and then it has just this really simple kind of like white etching floral, and so I thought that would be beautiful for the backing. And then how I make this quilt is the backing also folds over to the front to create the border. So this quilt is going to be absolutely so cute, and I cannot wait to see how it looks like with the puffy name garland. So anyways, that is all my fabric and the details for this project. So let me show you what all these prints look like close up, and then explain how I'm planning on making this quilt and these name letters a little bit more. So since there are 13 fat quarters, there are tons of beautiful prints. So we have this really bright, vibrant, large like floral print, the peachy, which matches my backing, so it's all tied in. Then we have this really cute pinky floral. Then we have this little watercolor, this very like naturally kind of wildflower floral, which I think is so pretty. And then this green and orange floral. So all the colors are going together, which is why I love getting a collection of fabric from a quilt store, because they just all go together and it's so pretty. I love mixed matched like fabric scraps, but you really cannot go wrong with the beautiful fabrics created by quilt fabric designers. So then we have this floral, the gingham, which is going to be my border. Then we have this floral. I absolutely love this blue and white. Like, this might be one of my favorite prints in the collection. And then this one with the little oranges, so cute. And then the last two florals, which are basically the same, but then different backing. So these are all of the different colors. So I'm going to have to decide which of these I want to use for her name. What I have left over, I'm going to cut a ton of 5-inch squares and use for her quilt. So I'm going to be using all these for the quilt, and then the border will be the green gingham, like all the way down, and the backing will be this. And I think it's just going to look so beautiful. To save myself some time creating the patterns for the letters, I decided to use Canva and choose a font that I could then just use the outline for and then print off, and that would essentially be my pattern. So I used the font Canva Sans. I made it super large where it would fit on an entire piece of paper, and then I opted for the effect of it just being an outline, and that's how I created my letter pattern. Once I created all of the letters for the name, I saved it as a PDF and then sent it to my printer to print out, and then it was time to start cutting out all of my letters. I did decide to extend my letters by about 1/4 of an inch when I was cutting them out, because I felt like I just needed a bit more seam allowance. After my letter patterns were ready, it was time to figure out which prints of fabric I wanted to be associated with which letters, so I played around with that for a bit, figuring out colors and prints and patterns and kind of what order they should go in to look the best. Alright, it is quite a little rainy and dreary day outside, so you can probably hear the rain in the background of this video. Hopefully you can hear me talking well enough. But I just cut out all of my paper patterns, and as you saw, I used Canva. Now when I cut it out of my fabric, I also added like 1/4-ish of an inch around it just for seam allowance. And I sewed up a little sample because I was a little worried on whether or not these letters would be the size that I wanted them to be, and I think that is where you can adjust and adapt this. If you make this for yourself, if you want the letters to be smaller, if you want them to be bigger, but this is the size that the K turned out to be in my sample. I think it's a little bit smaller than I wanted, but because I'm doing her first and her middle name, I think having a more like medium-sized letter is actually going to make the name garland look better rather than like giant jumbo letters. So I was thinking, and maybe I'll make another sample of this, of just like extending the length on all my letters. So like just extending it by like 1/2 inch at the top, 1/2 inch at the bottom, and then keeping all of the edges the same. And then it might allow me to have a little bit more height. I also sewed this on 1/4 of an inch seam allowance because that is what I cut it to on my little paper pattern. So anyways, that's my sample. I think I'm going to stick with it, and so now what I'm going to do is start cutting out all of my letters from my fat quarters. Originally I was thinking about just backing all of these letters in a solid color, but after I laid my letter pieces on the fabric, I realized that I actually have plenty of room to do them front and back of the fabric, and I will still have a ton of fabric left over for cutting out all of the quilt squares. So time to cut out all the letters.
Now that each letter has a corresponding fabric, it was time to cut out my letters from these fat quarters. And like I mentioned before, I did decide to add a 1/2 inch to the top and the bottom of each letter just to give them a little bit more length and also a little bit more seam allowance. I'm also using the fat quarter fabric for the front and the back of my letters, so I made sure to fold it so that it was doubled.
Okay, so I cut out all the letters. I actually decided to extend the tops and the bottoms by like 1/2 inch just to kind of help the sizing look a bit better. So now I'm going to start sewing these together, right sides together, sewing it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then as I'm sewing them, I think I'm also going to insert little loops at the top for like the hanging portion of the garland. Okay, so today I'm going to start cutting out all of the quilt squares. Now, before I start cutting them out, I made sure and press all of my fat quarters really nice and flat. A really important part of quilting is the precision of which you cut your squares or cut your shapes with your fabric. And so well-pressed fabric is super important. Usually, I don't press my fabric before I cut it out, but in quilting, I make sure and follow the rules. So again, as a reference, I'm using fat quarters, which are 18 by 22 inches. This is the fabric folded in half. So in total, this is how big it is. So it is a good amount of fabric. And since I bought this in a pack of 13 different prints, doing the math, I'm going to cut out 2 squares per print and then three squares for a couple of the prints because I'm going to need 30 squares in total for this quilt. Now these are all of my fat quarters that I have not cut into yet, but I am also going to be cutting squares out of the leftover fat quarters from cutting out my letters. For cutting my squares, I'm going to be using this super helpful quilting ruler. These are great because they are square, so it helps you to cut very accurate squares when you're quilting. And all I'm going to do is just measure my 5x5 square. Now, if you do not have one of these rulers, you can use just a typical sewing ruler like this because again, it will allow you to measure out 5x5. I like using rulers when I'm quilting because I'm able to put pressure down on my fabric and use a rotary cutter and get the most accurate and precise squares. Now, if you do not have any of these, you could create a pattern that is 5x5 inches with a piece of paper and then pin that on to your fabric, cut it out with scissors or weight it down and cut it out with a rotary cutter. Any of these methods work. Now here is the diagram and kind of pattern / math breakdown for the quilt I'm going to be making. So as you can see, this is essentially what the quilt is going to look like at the end of the day. It's going to be about 32 inches by 32 inches. So we are making this a square. Now, if you want to make this a longer quilt, you are just going to extend your quilted square rows by however many rows you want, and then do the math of extending the side borders. For my borders, I need one border that is 33 inches by 5 inches. That's going to be for the sides, and then I need a shorter border for the top and the bottom. That's going to be 23 inches by 5 inches. So I'm going to need 2 of those each, and in total I'm going to need 25 5-inch squares. Those are all going to be sewn together to create the center of my quilt. Now again, this is a baby quilt, so I'm making it a small square size so it can be used to, you know, put on the ground for a baby to lay on or play on. And it is a good size that you could wrap the baby in it as well. If you're wanting this to be the size of, let's say, a nursery crib, just measure the crib and then extend the quilt squares and the side borders by whatever those dimensions are.
Now that I've determined how many squares in total I need, it's time to start cutting out all of my quilt squares from all of my prints of fabric. As you can see, I'm using a rotary cutter and this handy square cutting ruler. Again, if you have a ruler, I would highly suggest using that. Otherwise, you can create a 5x5 paper pattern for your quilt squares. Now that all of my quilt squares are cut out, it's time to figure out what order I want all of these patterns to be sewn together for the quilt. I usually take a lot of time figuring out the exact layout and pattern of my quilt by laying out all of the squares and then mixing and matching their location till I get a design that I really like and feel is cohesive. And to keep with the intended size of this quilt, I'm laying out these quilt squares 5 squares across and 5 rows up. Now that I have my quilt layout, every row is stacked from left to right. So I'm going to take this entire stack over to my sewing machine. I will take the first 2 squares off the top, place them right sides together, and I'm going to sew them at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And then I will just keep taking squares from the pile until I finish that row, and then I will move on to the next. Now it is totally up to you if you would like to use pins when sewing your squares together. I prefer not to use pins because it saves time, so I just take my entire stack of squares over to my sewing machine and then I just continue sewing on new squares and laying them right sides together to save time. And this is what all 5 rows of the quilt look like once all of the squares are sewn together. After they're sewn together, it's time to press all of the seam allowance to the side. Unlike regular sewing where we press seams open, for quilting we want to press them to the side. And I actually alternate pressing my seam allowance to the left and then to the right for the next row, and then repeat to the left for the next row and the right for the next row. And I will explain why this is important later. And here you can see for row 1, my seam allowance is pressed to the left, and for row 2, it's pressed to the right. Now I'm going to take those 2 rows and I'm going to place them right sides together, matching up the seams at every single square. We really want these seams to be matched up for the most precise construction. And I usually just go ahead and pin all of my rows together at this point so that I can take the entire quilt top over to my sewing machine and sew all of the rows together. And just like sewing the quilt squares, sewing the rows together, we are also going to use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. It's very important that you use accurate seam allowance throughout the entire quilt so that all of your proportions and your squares are actually the same size when it's all said and done. And here's what the quilt top looks like when it's all sewn together. Now let me explain to you why I press the seam allowance different directions. An important part of the quilting process, when I was pressing these, I pressed my seams to the side and I would alter which side I pressed them to for each row so that when they matched up together, there would be less bulk on one side. And what that does is give you really crisp corners where every single square meets. And now it's time to press the seam allowance for the rows. There's no specific direction for pressing this seam allowance, so I usually press it all the same direction. Now that the main portion of our quilt top is done, it's time to start working on the border. But before we sew on the border, we need to cut the border strips. We are going to be cutting 2 35 inches by 5 inch strips that are going to be the side of the border, and we are going to then be cutting 2 23 by 5 inch strips that are going to be the top of the border. I just marked measurements for the widths and lengths that my borders needed to be and then cut them to the desired size. Now that the fabric border pieces are cut, it's time to start sewing those onto my quilt. I first start with the top sections of my border, placing it right sides together on my quilt, pinning it into place and sewing it with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. After the top sections of my border are sewn into place, I then pin and place my side borders right sides together, pin it, sew it, and then we are going to press it afterwards. And this is now what my quilt top looks like with the border. Now it's time to add the rest of the layers for this quilt to actually turn it into a quilt. First, I lay out my backing fabric, and then I'm going to sandwich my cotton quilt batting onto that, and then I'm going to place and really smooth out my quilt top onto those two layers. I'm going to cut my quilt batting to leave about a 1/2 inch hanging out, and then I'm going to go through with big safety pins and pin all 3 of my layers together so that my backing fabric and my quilt face don't shift. Now before I start quilting, I'm going to work on my quilt binding. This is built into the back fabric of the quilt, and I have provided all of the measurements and some of the more descriptive instructions and steps on the screen for this. Essentially, I'm going to be folding in the edges of my quilt backing to overlap it with my quilt border and then also create corners. This saves me a step from having to use bias tape by simply using the back fabric of my quilt. After I folded in the back fabric onto the front to create that border, I'm going to be pinning it into place all the way around the quilt and also paying attention to those pointed corners to make sure that the fabric overlaps there. Now before I start quilting, this specific project has a special detail, which is going to be a lace heart created from a remnant of my sister's wedding dress. She really wanted this special detail to be included in this quilt to really show the story of how her and her husband fell in love and have something for her daughter to remember their story. And now that the heart is sewn, it is time to start sewing the binding of this quilt. Now I love to use a decorative stitch to sew my bindings onto my quilt, but you can absolutely use a regular straight stitch doing an edge stitch on that binding. I chose to do kind of a floral decorative stitch, and so I'm going to be sewing that basically on the edge of my binding and then right overlapping onto the border of my quilt all the way around. After the border is stitched down, it's time to actually start quilting this quilt, which is essentially where I'm going to be sewing all 3 layers of the quilt together. And this is the actual quilting portion and where quilting gets its name. There are 2 different ways that you can quilt this together. I'm going with option 2, which is where I'm going to be sewing 1/8 inch to the left and to the right of each seam. This gives a more distinctive quilting design, but if you want an option that is much quicker, you can simply stitch in the ditch. Okay, I just finished quilting the quilt together, and I actually did a different quilting method than my typical quilting method. Usually I just stitch in the ditch, but I saw someone recently quilt where they actually did stitches to the side of the seams on both sides, and I thought it looked really pretty, so that's what I did with this quilt, and I absolutely love how it turned out. I also feel like it just looks so good on the back. And then my edging, where I sewed my binding to the quilt, I used this fun like floral stitch on my sewing machine, and then on my corners I just did a regular stitch. I always just think it's really fun to use the decorative stitches on my sewing machine when I am making quilts. A lot of people hand sew their binding to their quilts, which I definitely have done in the past, but sometimes it's fun to kind of save time and do a fun decorative stitch, and again it looks really good from the back. And then also here is the heart on the back. So this is fabric from my sister's wedding dress. So I just love that little detail on the back of this quilt. So I'm going to remove all of the pins. I'm going to also toss it in the washer and dryer to wash it so that it's like nice and clean and dried for her, and it is going to kind of change how the quilt looks a little bit, but it kind of allows the quilt to set into itself since it will be washed. And then lastly, I'm going to add one of my tags to the corner. I really wanted to have like tags made that said made with love by, and then it would have my name, but I haven't gotten around to making those. So we're just gonna put my typical logo here in the corner. I get these made with a website called Dutch Label Shop, and I've been using them for years, and I absolutely love the quality of these really pretty woven
tag. So that's gonna go right there, and then the quilt is done.
Now that the quilt is done, I'm picking up where I left off with all of my letters. Now that all of my letters are cut out of my fabric, I'm going to be pinning my fabric right sides together and then sewing around those edges on my sewing machine. I'm also going to insert the loops at the top of my letters so that they can be stitched in while I'm sewing around the letters. Wider letters are going to have 2 loops, or any letters that have multiple legs are also going to have 2 loops. I'm going to sew these letters together using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm also going to make sure to leave an opening on the side of each letter so that I can flip it right side out and also stuff it with polyfill. Now before I flip my letters right side out, I find it helpful to snip off all of the excess fabric at the corners, and also to snip all of the pointed corners and rounded corners so that the edges lay really nice and flat once the fabric is flipped right side out. I'm also using a handy corner poking tool to really get my corners nice and pointy and sharp. If you don't have one of these tools, you can use like a pencil or the ends of scissors. Now, because of how I decided to sew these letters, I ended up having openings in the middle of my letters like D's and O's and A's, so I opted to use a decorative stitch to close those interior sections of the letters, and I'll explain more about this in a minute.
Okay, so I finished sewing together all of my letters, and all I have to do now is stuff them and then sew up the openings that I left. Now, as I was sewing my letters, I realized that the letters that have openings in the middle, like O, D, R, A, that having my fabric right sides together, I wasn't able to sew the center openings and then still be able to flip the letters right side out. So what I decided to do is just leave the center openings unsewn, and then once I flipped it right side out and pressed it, I went back to my machine and I sewed those edges. I decided to use a decorative stitch on my sewing machine, so it's kind of like a scallop-ish in a way. I actually thought about using the scallop stitch, but I decided to go with this and then trim off any of kind of the threads and raw edges, and I do like how it turned out. Typically when I've seen these letter garlands online, they are actually sewn wrong sides together and the raw edges are just sticking out. I'll put a picture on the screen of what I'm talking about. However, I wanted my letters to look a little bit more high-end, and now that I am looking at them, I think I should have just done my letter garland like I've seen them online and just sewed them wrong sides together. Although I think once they are stuffed, these center stitches really are not going to look that bad, and I think that these honestly look better than if I would have just done a regular stitch. So anyways, I'm going to stuff them and then see how the letters look afterwards.
And now that my letters are flipped right side out, it's time to stuff them with polyfill. You can stuff them as full and stuffed as you want, or as little stuffing as you want. I ended up stuffing these letters a lot, so they had a lot of dimension, but that also meant that they were way heavier than I was expecting, so just keep that in mind if you try this project for yourself. Because of how I decided to sew my letters, I also realized that I had to sew the openings of the letters closed using hand sewing because they were way too bulky to put on my sewing machine. So this was a little tedious, but it did make the letters look really beautiful at the end. And when all my letters were done, it was time to string them up on this white gross grain ribbon that I got.
Okay, so I just finished putting together the name garland and it looks so cute. This definitely took way longer than I was expecting, I think mainly because I had those issues like I was explaining, figuring out how to sew the interior of letters, and then I realized that on the edges I actually had to hand sew it. It wasn't going to work to put it on my sewing machine, and so those edges closed, which technically I think the letters look so much better given the fact that I did hand sew them, and I do like that there are not raw edges on the outside. But again, if you decide to try this fun little DIY for yourself, I would probably recommend just the traditional method of wrong sides together, sew it, leave the raw edges on the outside, or you can even do a pinking shear edge and use pinking shear so that it doesn't fray. I think it would be so much quicker than this. But if you want the whole no raw edge look, there you go. I absolutely love how all these prints and colors turned out. I decided to make this heart to kind of break up the two words because I want them to be all on the same ribbon, but I am going to cut an additional ribbon in case my sister wants to split them up and have the first name and the middle name one on top of the other. But I absolutely love how this turns out. It is so cute. I have to show you what this looks like with the quilt. Okay, so here are the letters, and then here is the quilt, or what I can fit up the table with it, and it's just so absolutely cute together. Obviously all of this fabric is from the same collection. It is the Secret Garden print collection from Missouri Quilt Supply. I'll link all of the information about the fabric down below. I can't remember who the actual fabric designer is, but it's someone who has a ton of different collections of prints, and I just thought these were so pretty and fit the aesthetic my sister is going for her baby nursery, and they're also just so cheery. I did wash the quilt, and so all of the pieces have kind of like shrunk up and like settled into themselves together. So I do like how this looks now, and I think with the letters it is just absolutely so cute. I'm going to use the letters as part of the decorations at her baby shower, and then she'll open up the quilt at the baby shower.
At the end of the day, I love how this quilt and these fabric letters turned out. They definitely fit the vision I had in my head, and they look so cute. So I would love to know from you if you would try this project for yourself, or if you already have someone you're thinking about making this for. As always, thank you for watching my videos. It means so much to me that you tune in, and I hope that you enjoyed watching this fun sewing tutorial, making this baby quilt and these beautiful 3D letters. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you loved what you saw. I'll see you in the next video. Happy sewing!